Marry me before Monday, and I'll solve every problem in your life. Sophie Bennett thought the man standing outside her apartment door had to be joking. Rain hammered against the old Brooklyn building hard enough to rattle the windows, and the flickering hallway light above him made the scene feel unreal, almost like one of those expensive perfume commercials she saw on giant billboards downtown. Adrian Vale stood there in a charcoal overcoat darkened by rain, one hand gripping a small black velvet box, the other resting against the doorframe, as if he had rehearsed this moment 100 times and still hated every second of it. Sophie tightened her grip around the dish towel in her hands and stared at him in disbelief. "It's 2 in the morning," she whispered. "And you're insane." Adrian's jaw tightened slightly, but his pale blue eyes never left hers. "Probably," he said quietly. "But I'm also running out of time." Behind Sophie, the tiny apartment smelled like vanilla and burnt sugar from the cupcakes cooling on the counter. The mixer still hummed softly in the kitchen. She had been baking for a morning delivery order she desperately needed to keep because 3 unpaid notices sat unopened beside her microwave. Rent, electricity, final warning. The glamorous billionaire standing in her hallway somehow looked less comfortable than she felt. Sophie glanced down at the velvet box in his hand. Why would someone like you need a wife by Monday? For the first time since she opened the door, something flickered across Adrian's face. Not arrogance, not confidence. Exhaustion, the kind that sleep never fixed. "Because if I don't show up married to the board meeting Monday morning," he said, "I lose my company." Thunder rolled outside. Sophie almost laughed. Adrian Vale owned half the skyline in Manhattan. Everyone in New York knew his face. Financial magazines called him the Ice King of Wall Street. Women followed him with cameras every time he stepped out of a black SUV. And now he was standing outside apartment 4C, asking a girl covered in flour to marry him. "You don't even know me," she said carefully. Adrian finally looked past her shoulder into the apartment. At the crooked thrift store lamp beside the couch. At the stack of bakery boxes tied with string. At the orange cat asleep on the radiator. Then his gaze settled back on her. "Actually," he said softly, "I do." A chill moved down Sophie's spine that had nothing to do with the rain. Adrian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something folded neatly in half. A small paper receipt. He handed it to her slowly. Sophie unfolded it and frowned. It was from the corner deli downstairs 3 months ago. 2 coffees. 1 turkey sandwich. 1 bottle of water. Her stomach tightened as recognition hit her. The homeless veteran sitting outside the store in December. The old man shaking from the cold. Sophie had bought him food after finishing a 14-hour shift at the bakery. She looked back up at Adrian. "How do you have this?" "Because I was there," Adrian said. "And you were the only person who stopped." The hallway suddenly felt too small, too quiet. Sophie stared at him as rainwater dripped from the edge of his coat onto the cracked tile floor. "You've been watching me?" Adrian exhaled slowly, almost ashamed of the answer. "From the penthouse across the street," he admitted. "For months." Sophie's pulse quickened. Every instinct told her to shut the door immediately. Normal people did not show up after midnight with marriage proposals and secret observations. But Adrian Vale didn't look dangerous. He looked lonely. Deeply, painfully lonely. His eyes drifted toward the kitchen where the cupcakes sat cooling beneath soft yellow light. "Every night," he murmured, almost to himself, "your kitchen light stays on until 2 a.m. And somehow, it's the only warm thing I see from my window anymore." For several long seconds, Sophie could not find a single word to say. The rain outside softened into a steady whisper against the windows while Adrian remained standing in the hallway, like a man waiting for a verdict he already expected to lose. Sophie crossed her arms slowly over her flour-covered sweatshirt. "That is not romantic," she said carefully. "That is incredibly creepy." Adrian gave the faintest nod, almost accepting the insult before she finished speaking. No. So what exactly was your plan here? Show up in the middle of the night and ask your neighbor to marry you because she bought somebody a sandwich." His expression remained calm, but she noticed the exhaustion deepening around his eyes. "No," he said quietly. "My plan was to offer someone honest a deal." Sophie laughed once under her breath. "People like you do not make deals with people like me." "People like me," Adrian repeated softly, as if the phrase tasted bitter. He glanced down the empty hallway before speaking again. "My attorneys already prepared the contract. 6 months. Public appearances. Shared residence. After that, you walk away with enough money to never worry about rent again. Sophie stared at him in disbelief. Somewhere in the apartment, the old radiator hissed loudly. You really think money fixes everything? Adrian looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time his voice lost its polished billionaire calm. No, he admitted. If money fixed everything, I would not be standing outside your door at 2 in the morning asking a stranger to save my life. The words landed harder than she expected. Sophie looked away first. Her tiny kitchen suddenly felt embarrassingly small under his attention. The cracked cabinets, the flickering stove light, the stack of overdue bills she had tried to hide beneath a cookbook. Adrian noticed them anyway. Of course he did. Your landlord came by yesterday, he said carefully. Sophie's eyes snapped back toward him. How do you know that? Because he was yelling loud enough for the entire building to hear. Embarrassment flooded her face instantly. She remembered standing barefoot in the hallway while Mr. DeLuca threatened eviction if she missed another payment. She remembered pretending she was not about to cry. Adrian reached into his coat again and pulled out a folded envelope. This is not charity, he said before handing it over. Read it before you decide anything. Sophie hesitated before taking it. Inside was a bank check large enough to make her hands go cold. $50,000. Her breath caught instantly. This cannot even be real. It is. Why would you trust me with this? Adrian's gaze drifted toward the warm kitchen light again. Because every night when the rest of the city goes dark, your window stays lit. Sophie swallowed hard. The sincerity in his voice unsettled her more than the money. She had spent years being invisible in New York. Another exhausted girl working double shifts, carrying grocery bags up broken stairs, pretending everything was fine when it was not. But somehow this billionaire across the street had noticed every small thing she thought nobody saw. Adrian stepped back slightly, giving her space for the first time since she opened the door. The board meeting starts at 9 Monday morning, he said. If I show up unmarried, they remove me as chief executive officer before lunch. And if I say no? Sophie asked softly. Adrian's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Then I lose the company my mother spent her entire life building. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance again. Sophie looked down at the check in her trembling hands, then back at the man standing alone in the dim hallway. Adrian Vale looked powerful on magazine covers. Untouchable, cold, but standing there beneath the flickering apartment light, rainwater still dripping from his coat onto the floor, he looked like the loneliest man she had ever seen. Sophie barely slept after Adrian left. Long after the sound of his footsteps disappeared down the hallway, she remained standing beside the kitchen counter staring at the check in her hands while the city outside slowly faded from black into dark blue morning light. By 6:30, she was already back inside Bennett's Bakery on Lexington Avenue, tying her apron behind her waist while industrial mixers roared around her. The smell of cinnamon rolls and fresh coffee usually comforted her, but today every sound felt distant. Her coworker Maya slid beside her carrying a tray of croissants. You look terrible, she whispered. Thanks. That really helps. Maya narrowed her eyes immediately. Okay, what happened? Sophie hesitated before pulling the folded check from her jacket pocket. Maya nearly dropped the tray. $50,000? She gasped under her breath. Sophie, are you secretly selling state secrets? I wish. Sophie quickly shoved the check away before their manager noticed. My neighbor offered me a contract marriage last night. Maya blinked twice. Your hot billionaire neighbor? Sophie froze. You know who he is? Everyone knows who Adrian Vale is. Maya lowered her voice dramatically. That man has been on the cover of Forbes like 6 times. Sophie stared blankly at the rows of cupcakes she was frosting. Somehow hearing Adrian described like a celebrity made everything feel even less real. He said he needs a wife before Monday or he loses his company. Maya stared at her for several seconds before grabbing her shoulders. Sophie Bennett, if you do not marry that emotionally damaged billionaire immediately, I will personally drive you to City Hall myself. Sophie laughed despite herself, but the sound faded quickly. It is not funny. No, Maya admitted softly. It kind of is. Before Sophie could answer, the bakery bell chimed loudly. The morning rush had started. Business people in tailored coats lined up for coffee while exhausted parents dragged sleepy children toward school. Sophie moved automatically through the chaos, boxing pastries, steaming milk, smiling when she needed to. But her mind kept drifting back to Adrian standing in the rain outside her apartment, looking less like a billionaire and more like someone drowning quietly. Around 10 that morning, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Sophie hesitated before answering. Hello. Good morning, Miss Bennett. The woman's voice sounded polished and calm. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I am Mr. Vale's executive assistant. Sophie nearly dropped the frosting bag in her hand. Oh, Mr. Vale asked me to arrange transportation for you at noon if you wish to discuss the proposal further. Transportation? Sophie repeated weakly. A car will be waiting outside the bakery. Sophie looked through the front window automatically. Across the street sat a sleek black Rolls-Royce with a driver standing beside it holding an umbrella despite the clear sky. Customers inside the bakery were already staring. This is insane, Sophie muttered. Eleanor's voice softened slightly. Mr. Vale understands this situation is unusual. He also wanted me to mention that your landlord received payment for the next 12 months of rent this morning. Sophie's breath caught instantly. What? Your apartment is secure, Miss Bennett. Her stomach twisted. I did not agree to anything. No, Eleanor said gently. But he noticed your electricity was shut off twice last winter. Mr. Vale does not like people he cares about living in fear. The line went silent for a moment. Sophie stared out at the waiting car while the noise of the bakery blurred around her. Nobody had used words like that about her in a very long time. People he cares about. It sounded impossible. Dangerous, even. Yet somewhere high above the city, in a glass penthouse overlooking Manhattan, Adrian Vale had apparently been paying attention to every crack in her life, while she never noticed him watching at all. Sophie spent the next hour pretending she was not staring out the bakery window every 30 seconds. The black Rolls-Royce remained parked across the street like something from another universe, completely out of place beside delivery trucks and crowded sidewalks. Every time a customer opened the bakery door, cold February air swept inside, carrying the sounds of honking taxis and distant sirens. But Sophie barely noticed any of it anymore. By 11:45, Maya finally grabbed Sophie by the wrist and pushed her toward the employee locker room. Go, she ordered. Before I personally marry the billionaire myself. Sophie rolled her eyes, but her pulse had already started racing. 10 minutes later, she stepped outside wearing her cleanest coat and clutching her old canvas bag against her chest. The driver immediately opened the car door beneath a large black umbrella. Miss Bennett, he said politely. Sophie hesitated before sliding into the back seat. The leather smelled expensive, warm, unfamiliar. As the car pulled into Manhattan traffic, Sophie pressed her forehead lightly against the window and watched the city blur past. New York suddenly looked different from inside tinted glass. Cleaner, quieter, almost unreal. 20 minutes later, the Rolls-Royce stopped in front of Vale Tower. Sophie stared upward, her breath catching slightly. The skyscraper disappeared into low gray clouds, all steel and reflective glass, intimidating enough to make her feel underdressed just standing near it. Inside, the lobby gleamed with marble floors and towering white orchids arranged beneath crystal chandeliers. Men in tailored suits crossed the room carrying tablets and coffees, while women in heels moved with practiced confidence. Sophie instinctively tugged her sleeves lower over her hands. She looked like a bakery girl pretending to belong in somebody else's dream. Miss Bennett. Sophie turned toward the elegant blonde woman approaching her. Eleanor Hayes looked perfectly composed in a navy pantsuit, not a single strand of hair out of place. Mr. Vale is waiting upstairs. Sophie managed a nervous nod. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt endless. As the private doors finally opened, Sophie stepped into complete silence. The penthouse was enormous, but strangely empty. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the entire Manhattan skyline, gray winter lights spilling across sleek furniture and polished stone floors. It was beautiful in the same cold way museums were beautiful. Untouchable. Then Sophie noticed the dining table. A single untouched cup of coffee sat beside an open laptop covered in financial reports. Across the back of a chair hung Adrian's suit jacket, wrinkled as if he had not slept. The space suddenly felt less like a billionaire fantasy and more like a very expensive prison. Adrian stood near the windows, one hand in his pocket, while speaking quietly on the phone. Delay the Singapore call until tomorrow, he said calmly. I do not care if they are unhappy about it. He turned slightly and noticed her. Something in his expression softened instantly. I will call you back. The line disconnected. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sophie became painfully aware of her worn boots against the polished floor. Adrian crossed the room slowly, still dressed in dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled slightly upward. Without the overcoat and rain, he somehow looked younger, more human. Thank you for coming, he said quietly. Sophie folded her arms. You paid my rent. Adrian's expression tightened slightly. You sounded upset this morning. Because you cannot just interfere in somebody's life like that. I know. His voice remained calm. But watching you lose your apartment while I had the ability to stop it felt worse. Sophie stared at him, frustration and confusion twisting together inside her chest. Nobody had ever spoken to her like this before. Not carefully. Not like her problems mattered. Adrian gestured toward the dining table, where two neatly prepared folders waited beside coffee cups. The contract is there, he said softly. But before you read any of it, there is something you should know. Sophie looked up at him cautiously. Adrian hesitated for the first time since she met him. My mother built this company from nothing, he said quietly. And before she died, she left one condition in her will. His eyes drifted toward the skyline beyond the windows. She said the company should belong to someone capable of building a family, not just an empire. Sophie lowered herself slowly into one of the dining chairs while Manhattan stretched endlessly behind Adrian through the glass walls of the penthouse. Snow had started falling lightly outside, soft white flakes drifting between skyscrapers high above the streets below. The city looked quieter from up here, almost peaceful, but nothing about the man standing across from her felt peaceful. Adrian remained near the windows with both hands resting in his pockets, as if standing still was the only thing keeping him together. Sophie glanced down at the contract folder on the table, but did not open it yet. Your mother really put that in her will? She asked softly. Adrian nodded once. She built Vale Capital after my father left when I was 12. His voice stayed calm, but Sophie noticed the subtle tension in his jaw again. She believed companies reflected the people running them. She used to say a man who cannot love anyone eventually destroys everything around him. Sophie looked down at the untouched coffee beside her hands. Somehow the giant penthouse suddenly felt much sadder than impressive. And the board thinks you are that man. Adrian gave a faint, humorless smile. The board thinks I work too much, trust nobody, and treat my life like a spreadsheet. He paused briefly. They are not entirely wrong. Silence settled gently between them. Sophie finally opened the contract folder. The pages inside were perfectly organized, every paragraph precise and cold. Temporary marriage agreement. Public appearances required. Shared residence mandatory. Confidentiality clauses. Financial compensation. The language sounded less like love and more like a business merger. Yet somehow Adrian himself did not feel cold in the way the contract did. He felt tired. Deeply tired. Sophie reached the final page and stopped. Wait. She looked back up at him. You already signed this. Adrian nodded again. I wanted you to know I was serious before asking you to consider it. Sophie stared at his signature written neatly across the bottom of the page. Adrian Vale. One of the richest men in New York had apparently signed a marriage contract before she had even agreed to meet him. This is crazy, she whispered. Adrian slowly crossed the room and pulled out the chair across from her. For the first time since she arrived, he sat down close enough for her to notice the shadows beneath his eyes and the slight exhaustion softening his usually controlled expression. Probably, he admitted quietly. But I have spent my entire adult life surrounded by people pretending to care about me because of what I own. His gaze lifted toward her steadily. You are the first person I have seen in years who helps people when nobody is watching. Sophie's throat tightened unexpectedly. She looked away first. Outside, snow continued drifting across the skyline, while the penthouse remained silent except for the distant hum of the city below. Adrian rested his forearms lightly against the table. There are conditions you can add, he said carefully. If you want separate bedrooms, fine. If you want privacy clauses, fine. If you want to walk away after 6 months without explanation, also fine. Sophie blinked at him. You really planned all of this? No, Adrian said softly. I planned the contract. I did not plan you. Something about the honesty in his voice made her chest tighten again. Sophie quickly stood and walked toward the massive windows, suddenly needing distance. From 40 stories above Manhattan, the streets looked tiny. Cars moved like glowing dots beneath falling snow. Somewhere down there was her tiny apartment with flickering lights and cupcake batter still sitting in bowls beside the sink. That life suddenly felt impossibly far away. What happens if people find out this marriage is fake? She asked quietly without turning around. Adrian stood behind her, leaving enough distance not to crowd her. Then I lose everything. Sophie finally looked back at him over her shoulder. And what happens to me? For a moment Adrian did not answer. His expression softened in a way she had not seen before, quieter and more vulnerable than the Billionaire magazines ever captured. If you say yes, he said gently, then for the next 6 months, you will never have to carry the weight of the world alone again. Sophie stayed by the window for a long time after Adrian spoke. Below them, Manhattan shimmered beneath falling snow while warmth from the penthouse lights reflected softly against the glass. She could feel Adrian standing quietly behind her, not pushing, not rushing her decision, and somehow that unsettled her more than the contract itself. Every other difficult thing in her life had come with pressure. Bills demanded payment. Landlords demanded rent. Employers demanded overtime. But Adrian Vale, one of the most powerful men in New York, simply waited. Finally, Sophie turned slowly toward him. If I say yes, she said carefully, there are rules. Adrian nodded immediately. Anything. No lying to me. The answer came faster than she expected, almost instinctive. Adrian's expression shifted slightly, as if those 4 words mattered more than every page in the contract folder. Agreed. Sophie folded her arms tightly. And I am not pretending to be somebody else. I would not ask you to. I mean it, she continued nervously. I cannot suddenly become one of those women in expensive dresses who knows which fork to use at fancy dinners. To her surprise, Adrian smiled faintly for the first time since she met him. It changed his entire face. Softer, warmer, human. That is actually the part one am counting on. Sophie stared at him in disbelief. You are serious. Completely. He walked toward the kitchen area and poured fresh coffee into 2 cups before sliding one toward her carefully. The board already knows how to deal with polished socialites, he said quietly. They do not know how to deal with someone genuine. Sophie wrapped her cold hands around the warm ceramic mug. The smell of coffee mixed with the faint scent of cedar from Adrian's cologne, and suddenly the giant penthouse did not feel quite so cold anymore. Adrian leaned lightly against the counter across from her. There is one more thing, he said. Sophie looked up cautiously. Monday night is the Vale Foundation Winter Gala. Her stomach dropped immediately. Absolutely not. Adrian almost smiled again. You would only need to survive 3 hours. 3 hours surrounded by billionaires sounds like psychological warfare. A quiet laugh escaped him before he could stop it. Sophie blinked. The sound surprised both of them. Adrian lowered his eyes briefly, almost embarrassed by it. Sorry, he murmured. I just have not laughed in a while. The honesty in his voice made something inside Sophie ache unexpectedly. She looked down at her coffee. That is kind of sad. Most honest things are. Silence settled again, softer this time. Snow continued falling outside while the penthouse lights glowed warm against the darkening afternoon sky. Sophie realized suddenly that she had been here nearly 2 hours and Adrian had not checked his phone once. Not once. A man whose entire life revolved around billion-dollar decisions had spent the afternoon listening to a bakery worker explain why she hated fancy dinner parties. The thought felt strangely intimate. Then a soft buzzing sound interrupted the moment. Adrian glanced toward the kitchen counter where his phone vibrated repeatedly. The screen lit up with the name Victor Vale, Adrian's older brother. His expression hardened almost instantly. Sophie noticed the shift immediately. The softness disappeared from his face like a door quietly closing. Adrian declined the call without answering. Seconds later, another message appeared across the screen. Monday. Do not embarrass this family again. Sophie looked away awkwardly, pretending she had not read it. Adrian exhaled slowly before meeting her eyes again. You should know something before deciding. His voice was calm, but the tension had returned to it. My family does not want me to keep this company. Sophie frowned slightly. Why? Adrian hesitated. Then he said quietly, because my father built the business empire, but my mother built the soul of it. And after she died, they made sure I never forgot which side of the family they considered weak. Sophie did not leave the penthouse until nearly sunset. By the time Adrian's driver pulled up outside her apartment building again, Snow had covered the sidewalks in a soft white layer that reflected the city lights like scattered glass. She stepped out of the car slowly, her mind spinning from everything she had heard that afternoon. Contract marriage, billion-dollar board meeting, family betrayal. None of it felt real. Yet when she looked up toward the towering penthouse windows across the street, she could not stop thinking about the sadness in Adrian's eyes whenever his family was mentioned. Inside apartment 4C, the familiar warmth of vanilla and old radiator heat wrapped around her immediately. The orange cat stretched lazily across the couch, while cupcake trays still sat cooling beside the kitchen counter exactly where she had left them that morning. Her small apartment suddenly looked even smaller after seeing Adrian's world. But strangely, it also felt more alive. Sophie pulled off her coat and froze when she noticed a small black box sitting neatly on the kitchen table. Confused, she stepped closer. A note rested beside it in elegant handwriting. For the gala Monday. No pressure. Adrian. Sophie slowly opened the box. Inside lay a dark blue evening gown folded carefully between tissue paper. Simple, but breathtakingly elegant. Not flashy, not covered in diamonds. Just soft silk that looked like midnight under moonlight. Beneath it rested another note. Eleanor insisted I should not choose the dress myself. Sophie laughed quietly despite herself. The sound echoed softly through the apartment. Somehow she could already picture Adrian awkwardly standing in a luxury boutique while someone explained fashion to him. Her smile faded as she touched the fabric gently. Nobody had ever bought her something beautiful without expecting something in return. Her phone buzzed suddenly in her coat pocket. Maya. Sophie answered immediately. Tell me everything, Maya demanded before Sophie could even speak. An hour later, Maya sat cross-legged on Sophie's couch holding the blue gown against herself dramatically while half-eaten cupcakes covered the coffee table between them. You are marrying Gotham City's saddest billionaire, Maya announced. Sophie groaned softly. I am not marrying him. Temporary fake marriage. Same emotional damage. Sophie leaned back against the couch cushions, exhaustion finally catching up with her. I do not even understand why he picked me. Maya lowered the dress slowly. Actually, I think you do. Sophie frowned slightly. Maya gestured around the apartment. You make people feel safe, sophomore. Her voice softened. You always have. Sophie looked away uncomfortably. Safe was not a word anyone had used to describe her before. Broke, exhausted, overworked, sure. But not safe. Maya studied her carefully for a moment. Do you like him? Sophie opened her mouth to deny it immediately, but the answer never came. Instead, she remembered Adrian quietly laughing in the penthouse kitchen. The way his face softened whenever he stopped trying to act like a billionaire. The loneliness in his voice when he admitted he had not laughed in a long time. Sophie sighed heavily. I think he is lonely. Maya smiled faintly. That was not the question. Before Sophie could respond, loud voices echoed from the hallway outside her apartment. A second later, someone pounded sharply on her door. Sophie frowned and stood quickly. When she opened it, her landlord, Mr. DeLuca, stood there looking nervous beside a tall man in an expensive gray coat. The stranger smiled politely, but the expression never reached his eyes. Miss Bennett, he said smoothly. My name is Victor Vale. Sophie's stomach tightened instantly. Adrian's brother. Victor glanced past her shoulder into the apartment before speaking again. I was hoping we could discuss my brother before you make a very expensive mistake. Sophie instinctively tightened her grip on the edge of the door as Victor Vale stepped into the apartment hallway with calm, effortless confidence. Unlike Adrian, whose presence carried quiet exhaustion, Victor looked perfectly polished. His gray cashmere coat probably cost more than Sophie's yearly rent, and the expensive watch beneath his sleeve flashed beneath the dim hallway light as he adjusted it casually. Yet something about his smile made Sophie uneasy immediately. It felt practiced, empty. I think there has been some misunderstanding, Sophie said carefully. Victor glanced briefly toward Maya, sitting frozen on the couch, before returning his attention to Sophie. Actually, he said smoothly, I think you understand the situation very well. Mr. DeLuca awkwardly cleared his throat beside him. I will just leave you folks to talk. The landlord disappeared down the hallway almost instantly. Victor stepped inside without waiting for permission, his eyes moving slowly across the apartment. The old couch, the cupcake boxes, the worn hardwood floors. Sophie suddenly hated the way he looked at everything, as if measuring how little it was worth. Maya stood quickly. I should probably go. Sophie gave her a grateful look as Maya grabbed her coat and whispered softly near her ear. Call me if the evil brother tries anything. The apartment door closed behind her, leaving Sophie alone with Victor. Silence settled heavily between them. Victor finally turned toward the blue evening gown folded carefully on the couch. His expression darkened slightly. Interesting, he murmured. Adrian never notices things like dresses. Sophie crossed her arms. What do you want? Victor smiled again, but colder this time. I came because my brother has always had terrible instincts when emotions get involved. Sophie frowned. You make him sound dangerous. No, Victor corrected softly. I make him sound lonely. The words caught her off guard because they sounded true. Victor slowly removed a folded document from inside his coat pocket and handed it toward her. Read page 3. Sophie hesitated before taking it. The document appeared to be some kind of private investigation report. Her stomach tightened as she scanned the page. Age, employment history, financial records, daily routines, notes about the bakery, notes about her apartment, notes about the night she bought food for the homeless veteran outside the deli. Sophie's face went pale. What is this? The reason Adrian chose you. Victor's voice remained calm. My brother does not trust emotions. He trusts data. Sophie stared at the pages in disbelief, while humiliation crawled slowly up her throat. Every vulnerable detail of her life reduced to bullet points and psychological observations. He investigated me? Victor gave a small shrug. Adrian investigates everyone. Business partners, employees, women. Sophie looked physically sick now. Victor noticed immediately. I thought you deserved honesty before this arrangement goes further. He glanced around the apartment again before lowering his voice slightly. You seem like a decent girl, Miss Bennett. But my brother has spent his entire life turning people into carefully managed solutions. Sophie's chest tightened painfully. The warmth she had started feeling toward Adrian suddenly tangled with embarrassment and anger. Had every conversation been calculated? Every thoughtful gesture researched beforehand? Victor stepped closer, though his tone remained perfectly polite. Do not misunderstand me. Adrian probably believes he cares about you. The words somehow hurt worse than if he had insulted her directly. Probably believes. Sophie folded the papers tightly in trembling hands. Why are you showing me this? Victor looked toward the skyline outside the apartment windows. Because Monday morning the board will vote on the future of Vale Capital. He turned back toward her slowly. And if Adrian walks into that meeting married to a woman they cannot control, he wins. Sophie frowned slightly. You mean you lose? For the first time, Victor's smile faded. Completely. The silence that followed confirmed everything. Sophie suddenly understood the tension in Adrian's face every time his family was mentioned. This was not just business. This was war hidden beneath expensive suits and polite conversations. Victor buttoned his coat calmly. My brother thinks kindness makes people trustworthy, he said quietly. It does not. It makes them vulnerable. He moved toward the door before pausing one final time. Ask yourself something honestly, Miss Bennett. If Adrian Vale had been poor and ordinary, would he still have noticed your kitchen light every night? The door closed softly behind him, leaving Sophie standing alone in the middle of her apartment with the investigation report trembling in her hands and the blue gala dress glowing silently beneath the kitchen light. Sophie did not sleep that night. The investigation report remained spread across her kitchen table beside untouched coffee and the dark blue gala dress folded carefully beneath the warm apartment light. Outside, snow continued falling softly over Brooklyn while the city drifted toward morning, but inside apartment 4C, everything felt painfully still. Every page of the report replayed in her mind like a bruise she could not stop pressing. Notes about her routines, her financial struggles, her habits. The idea that Adrian had studied her before ever knocking on her door made her chest ache in ways she did not fully understand. Yet beneath the embarrassment and anger, another thought kept returning no matter how hard she tried to ignore it. Adrian himself had never lied to her. He had admitted he watched her, admitted he trusted data more than emotions, admitted he did not know how to build a real life anymore. By Sunday afternoon, Manhattan buzzed with preparations for the Vale Foundation Winter Gala. Luxury cars lined the streets outside the Grand Hotel, while photographers crowded behind velvet ropes beneath glittering lights. Inside the penthouse across from Sophie's apartment, Adrian stood alone in front of the windows, adjusting the cuff of his black tuxedo for the third time. Eleanor watched him carefully from across the room. She is not answering calls, Adrian asked quietly. Eleanor shook her head once. Adrian lowered his eyes briefly. The silence in the penthouse felt heavier than usual tonight. No smell of vanilla. No warm kitchen light from across the street. Nothing. For the first time in years, Adrian looked uncertain. Perhaps, Eleanor said gently, you should consider that she may simply be hurt. Adrian gave a faint, humorless smile. I know exactly why she is hurt. His voice dropped lower. Victor found the investigation files. Eleanor sighed softly. You were trying to protect yourself. No, Adrian corrected quietly. I was trying to control something before I ruined it. Downstairs, the ballroom slowly filled with investors, celebrities, and reporters while whispers about Adrian Vale's mysterious future wife spread through the crowd. Victor stood near the champagne tower speaking confidently with board members, looking perfectly composed. But every few seconds his eyes drifted toward the ballroom entrance. Waiting. Adrian entered alone at exactly 7:30. Cameras flashed instantly. Conversations lowered to murmurs. Victor's expression sharpened almost invisibly as he approached his brother with a polite smile. No wife, he asked smoothly. Adrian's face remained unreadable. No performance tonight, Victor. That is disappointing. Adrian glanced briefly around the crowded ballroom before answering quietly. Maybe I am finally tired of treating people like strategies. For the first time, Victor looked genuinely surprised. Before he could reply, the ballroom doors opened again. Every conversation stopped. Sophie stepped inside wearing the dark blue gown Adrian had sent her. The silk caught the chandelier light like midnight water while snowflakes still melted softly against her coat. She looked nervous, real, beautiful in a way that did not belong to the ballroom at all. Adrian froze completely. Across the crowded room, Sophie met his eyes steadily. Then she walked toward him. The crowd parted automatically around her while reporters whispered frantically. Victor's confident expression disappeared inch by inch. Sophie finally stopped in front of Adrian close enough to see the disbelief in his face. You investigated me, she said softly. Adrian nodded once immediately. Yes. You treated me like a business decision. Pain flickered openly across his expression now. At first, Sophie studied him for several long seconds while the entire ballroom watched in silence. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out the investigation report folded neatly in half. Adrian's face tightened instantly. Sophie held his gaze as she tore the papers slowly down the center. Gasps echoed quietly around the room. Good, she said softly. Because if we are going to survive this, no more studying me like data. Adrian looked at her as if he could barely breathe. Sophie stepped closer and gently adjusted the black tie he had unknowingly crooked earlier. You are terrible at pretending not to care about people, she whispered. Something inside Adrian finally broke open then. Not dramatically, quietly, like ice beginning to melt after a very long winter. For the first time all evening, the loneliness disappeared from his eyes.